Welcome to the webinar on the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or TTIP, and animal welfare. This is the fifth webinar in a series on TTIP, agriculture, and food systems organized in cooperation between the Agriculture and Rural Convention, ARC 2020, and the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. I'm Robert Peterson, the Food Policy Coordinator at ARC 2020, a platform of about 160 European food and agriculture organizations working for a more equitable, sustainable, and healthy food and farming policy. And I'll be moderating today's webinar. As we will hear in more detail, the EU and US have very different rules and regulations on animal welfare in farm animals, and a number of concerns have been voiced on how TTIP will affect progress made in animal welfare. Today's webinar will explore rules on animal welfare in the EU and the US and the potential impact that TTIP will have. TTIP is intended to harmonize standards, and this could jeopardize laws both at state level in the US and EU animal welfare standards. We have two excellent speakers today. Our first speaker is Joyce Tischler as our first speaker. And as our second speaker, we have Olga Kiku, who is the manager of the European Affairs at Compassion in World Farming in Brussels. Olga is an important factor in Brussels in advancing animal welfare in farm animals on the political agenda, and a valuable asset in discussion on how to build more sustainable, just, and healthy food systems. I would like to just spend now I see that I had the wrong slide up, but I would just like to spend a minute explaining how the webinar works. On the right hand of your screen, you'll see a drop-down box where you can enter questions. This is indicated by the red arrow. We'll be accepting questions throughout the webinar, and then after the presentations, we'll have time to answer as many of the questions as possible that you have asked. Also, in about a day's time, the webinar and presentations will be posted on both the ARC and IATP's website and in their entirety. So let's go ahead and get started with Joyce Tischler. Joyce will give us an introduction to animal welfare rules in the US and I suppose at some state level. So with that, go ahead, Joyce.
Thank you, Robert. I'm switching, okay, to full screen. Hold on a moment, folks, and I'll be with you. And I want to wish you all a good day. I'm Joyce Tischler with Animal Legal Defense Fund, and I'm going to talk about the U.S. laws relevant to farmed animals. For those of you who don't live in the U.S., I first want to explain that our statutory laws are divided into federal and state level laws. Federal laws include all laws that are passed by the U.S. Congress, and these laws apply to all 50 states and everyone who lives in those states. State laws apply only to the people in that state. They are passed by the state legislatures, and for example, if a law is passed in New York State, it applies to everyone in that state. It does not apply to Vermont or New Jersey or to any other state. If a federal law and a state law cover the same subject and there's a conflict, the general rule is that the federal law preempts or overrules the state law. And so with that, let's get into the laws relevant to animals. In the U.S., we raise, we kill 10 billion animals per year for food, and most of them are raised in what's called concentrated animal feeding operations. The acronym for that is CAFO. They are also more commonly known to the public as factory farms. These animals are forced to live their entire lives in intensive confinement, and you see the birds there, the chickens, in the battery cages. They're overcrowded. There's no privacy for these animals. They can't exhibit any natural behaviors. They can't move about freely. They cannot get away from more aggressive animals. They're completely bored because there's nothing to do. It's filthy, and the air quality is absolutely awful for them, causing disease. Most people presume that there are strong laws to protect these animals from abuse. So we're going to look at these laws, and I have gone too far, sorry. The first law we're going to look at is the Federal Animal Welfare Act. This sets minimum standards for animals in research labs and in transportation, zoos and circuses and puppy mills, but that law specifically excludes farmed animals from its protections, so they are not protected under that act. The next federal law is the Federal Humane Transport Act, also known as the 28-Hour Act. Someone who's transporting animals across state lines can't confine those animals for more than 28 hours. At some point, they have to unload the animals and provide them with food, water, and rest. This law is specifically limited to transportation. It doesn't extend to the living conditions at the CAFO, the factory farm, which is 99% of the time that animals are alive. It also does not apply to poultry, and you can see this chicken truck, and it says Tyson at the bottom. I presume that's a Tyson chicken truck. Tyson is one of the largest poultry producers in the United States, and you can also see in the middle that the birds have been crushed, that they're not protected very well. Chickens, ducks, turkeys are by far the largest number of animals who are raised for food in the U.S. The third federal law relevant to farmed animals is the Federal Humane Methods of Livestock Slaughter Act, and this law requires that slaughter be carried out humanely. In other words, the livestock have to be rendered unconscious and insensible to pain before they're actually killed. This law also excludes poultry, chickens, ducks, geese, and animals who are killed for ritual slaughter. And it does not apply to animals while they are alive on the factory farm in the CAFOs. So for 99% of the time that farmed animals in the U.S. are alive and in the CAFO, there is no federal law that applies to them that offers them protections, nothing. Let's go to the state level. Every state in the U.S. has an anti-cruelty law, and these laws define what cruelty is. And cruelty is failure to provide adequate shelter, food, veterinary care, and a variety of other things. In the past 25 years, the state anti-cruelty laws have been improved in a variety of ways, but the meat industry has convinced legislators in the U.S., in the majority of U.S. states, to either exempt or exclude farmed animals or the standard customary husbandry practices that are the rule on a factory farm. So in most states in the U.S., farmed animals or the standard customary practices are excluded or exempted from the reach of the state anti-cruelty laws. And you can see on your screen the Washington state anti-cruelty law is typical of what these laws say about farmed animals. What are standard customary husbandry practices? Well, you're looking at one. These are gestation crates, and they are about 7 feet long by about 2 feet wide. As you can see, all the pigs can do is stand up and lie down. They're living in their own excrement. They have absolutely nothing to do, and these are intelligent animals. They are treated as if they were machines, as if they were pencils placed in a row. Unfortunately, these are sentient beings who suffer greatly because of this treatment. Debeaking of chickens, dehorning of cattle, which is cutting off their horns, hot iron branding of cattle, the castration of the male animals. All of these are customary standard practices that are carried out without anesthesia or pain relief, and they are excluded from the state anti-cruelty laws. Therefore, the producers who carry out these activities cannot be prosecuted for cruelty. So, what do you do when there is no law? And that is the problem that activists and advocates in the U.S. have faced. Where do you go? One thing that we have done that has been highly effective is to use an alternative to going to state legislatures, because honestly, state legislatures are beholden to large agricultural interests, and so it's very difficult, if not impossible, to get a law through the state legislature. What we did instead was use something called the voter initiative process, or the ballot initiative process. This exists in some U.S. states, not all. And here's how it works. A voter drafts the language for a proposed law, has it printed on these petitions, and takes the petitions to other voters. The voter has to collect hundreds of thousands of signatures, and if they collect the requisite number of signatures, then it gets on the ballot for an election. And at that time, it goes to the election, and if the voters vote in favor of this law, it becomes law. It bypasses the legislature. They're not involved. And as you can see, starting in 2002, advocates went to a variety of states, the ones that have this process, and were able to pass these bans on gestation crates, veal crates, battery cages. As you'll also see, by 2007, the legislatures were beginning to become involved because they were concerned that these voter initiatives were going to go beyond what they wanted to do. So the Oregon legislature brought about a gestation crate ban, and you can see in 2010 the Ohio Farm Bureau got involved. These initiatives are extremely expensive. They cost millions of dollars, but they have been game changers in the U.S. They involve the American consumer, and the consumer demands began to bring about change in our meat industry. In fact, Smithfield, the largest pork producer, is now phasing out gestation crates, and my information is they're about 70% of the way in doing that. National companies such as Unilever, Hellmann's, Burger King, Nestle have all converted to 100% cage-free egg use across the nation, all because of consumer demand, which is very exciting. But it's not all rosy. Some in the agriculture industry, instead of changing to give better welfare, have taken a different tact. They want to keep whistleblowers away from the CAFROs, the factory farms. They want to keep them from recording and publicizing the cruel conditions in those places. So they've passed what we call ag-gag laws. They make it a crime to take photographs and videos inside the factory farm. There are 7 states that have passed ag-gag laws, and I've put on the screen a portion of the Utah ag-gag law. Many other states have introduced them, but at this point the animal advocates have been able to defeat each one that's been introduced. So you can see the wording of this. It's really an extraordinary kind of law, and very much goes against our First Amendment in the U.S., which is the right to free speech. My organization, Animal Legal Defense Fund, is suing in Utah and in Idaho to challenge these ag-gag laws on a U.S. constitutional basis. And we are representing animal advocates, environmentalists, journalists, and others who wish to collect evidence of violations of cruelty laws and other laws on factory farms, and are afraid to do so because they risk prosecution, they risk going to prison. Olga is going to tell you how the EU is dealing with the drug ractopamine. I will just note that in the U.S., ractopamine is legal. It is approved by the Federal Food and Drug Administration. It is used quite widely as an additive to the feed given to farmed animals. In particular, 60 to 80% of U.S. pigs are fed ractopamine, and it's also added to cattle and turkey feed. And we filed a lawsuit to challenge the FDA's approval of this drug. And that's one of dozens of lawsuits in the U.S. That has been filed by animal and environmental organizations and food safety groups challenging this system and the way that it harms the animals, humans, and the environment. So I'll end by saying that as standards of decency are broadening in my country, we are just beginning to offer greater protections to farmed animals. The animals we raise and kill for food are largely voiceless in the U.S., and they receive precious few legal protections. The U.S. lags far behind Europe in passing legislation that offers protections to farmed animals, and until the past decade, the meat industry in my country has been in total control, which is clearly evidenced by the absence of laws and regulations, and it's fighting as hard as it can to offer as few protections as it can. So thank you.
So thank you, Joyce, for that very comprehensive presentation. And next up we have Olga Kiku, who's going to, from Compassion in World Farming, who's going to tell us a little bit about the situation in Europe and some of the concerns that have been raised on TTIP and how it might affect animal welfare standards. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Good morning to the American participants and good afternoon to the European ones. I'll say a few words about the European system for our American participants. The way the EU system works is actually, the EU is actually a region which is composed of 28 member states, 28 countries that is, and we have basically a number of EU institutions. Three of those, the most important ones in terms of legislation, are the Commission, first of all, which is an institution which proposes law, the Parliament, consisting of MEPs, European Parliament members from all 28 member states, and they vote on laws that are proposed by the Commission, and the same goes for the Council. The Council also consists of the representatives, the heads of state and the ministers of the 28 member states, and they also vote on laws. Our farm animal welfare in the EU is actually, the EU officials claim that our farm animal welfare system is actually the highest, has the highest standards in the world, and they're quite proud of it. We do understand that maybe we're ahead of other countries, but it doesn't mean that we have a rosy picture here, that things are going well. I will start by talking about the principle behind EU legislation, which is based on the 5 freedoms. These are the ones you see on the slide. The freedom from hunger and thirst by ready access to fresh water and a diet to maintain full health and vigor for the animals. The freedom from discomfort by providing an appropriate environment, including shelter and a comfortable resting area. The freedom from pain, injury, or disease by prevention or rapid diagnosis and treatment of disease. The freedom to express most normal behavior by providing sufficient space, proper facilities, and company of the animal's own kind. And last, the freedom from fear and distress by ensuring conditions and treatment which avoid mental suffering. Now, these are considered aspirational, okay? It doesn't mean that they are actually, that you can always find them in our farm systems in the EU. Okay, this slide, I'm gonna, okay, I'll do it. The legislation that that actually has been, was quite progressive in a way, and sort of changed the, turned the page for the EU, was the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, or otherwise called the Lisbon Treaty. And Article 13 in the treaty talks about animals recognizes animals as sentient beings. This is very important, not just for current legislation, but we feel that we'll be able to advance legislation, and in the future we might be able to achieve more progressive laws regarding farm animals, but also all species. If you look at the second paragraph, the treaty actually reads that in formulating and implementing the Union's agriculture, fisheries, transport, internal market, research and technological development and space policies, the Union and the member states shall, since animals are sentient beings, pay full regard to the welfare requirement of animals. Okay, this provision, the full regard provision, applies both when EU and member states are dealing directly with animal welfare, and also when addressing other matters that are likely to have a direct or indirect impact on animal welfare. It means that member states and the EU have to take animal welfare into account in comprehensive, thorough, and serious manner in formulating and implementing EU policy in those specified fields. And in case where low priority is accorded to animal welfare, must be able to give the member states must be able to give full explanation and justification for this. Okay, because they have to actually say why certain recommendations or laws have not been fully have been ignored. You can see here the legislation on farm animals that we have. I tried to summarize what we have at this point. We have a transport regulation which refers to, it's actually quite descriptive. It talks about journey times, food and water and rest of the animals, journey logs. It talks about the training of drivers and other issues. We have a slaughter regulation which refers to the stunning and bleeding of animals. And we have important EU bans on the veal crates, which came into effect since 2007, on battery cages, which came into effect in 2012, and on sow stalls, which actually came into effect in 2013. Now, we also have the directive on the protection of animals kept for farming purposes, which is a general directive. It applies to all other animals that the species-specific directives do not apply. For example, dairy cows, rabbits, ducks, and geese, and other farm animals, we don't have specific species directives for them, although we wish to. And we're lobbying for these. So in this case, the general directive applies. We also have species-specific directives on for example, the laying hens directive, which refers to the different systems, the free-range system, the barn system, and also the cage system, and it also refers to the labeling of eggs from the different systems. We have a labeling system for eggs which starts from 0 for organic, 1 for free range, 2 for barn eggs, and 3 for eggs from caged hens. We also have the old battery cages which were not enriched are actually banned now. We have a broilers directive which refers to the maximum density of how many animals you can have in a certain space. We have a calves directive with requirements, for example, no tethering for calves, etc. And we have a pigs directive which refers to prohibitions on the tethering of sows, provision for enrichment materials for pigs, fully slatted floors are prohibited, routine tail docking, not all tail docking, but routine tail docking, routine teeth clipping and grinding are prohibited, and it also talks about castration and how it should be done with anesthesia or analgesia, etc. Despite these laws, we do. I forgot to say that. Besides these laws, that member states can actually apply higher standards if they want to, which actually this is not the case for most member states. So despite these laws, we do have a lot of problems regarding implementation of existing rules. We also want to pass legislation regarding species-specific laws about the species where we don't have specific legislation, and we also have a number of problems in trade with our countries where these laws do not apply. Therefore, we have big problems. For example, now in Europe we have serious problems with the export of live animals to non-EU countries, where all these laws do not apply. Therefore, there is no protection level, actually protection level is almost none. The farm-to-fork approach has been sort of the guiding principle behind what is taking place now in Europe, which means actually that every phase of the production is regulated and closely monitored. On one hand, we have the time from the time the animal is born till the animal is slaughtered, and from slaughter through processing till the animal ends up on the table. So this is the principle. Now, regarding TTIP, there's been a lot of talk and a lot of discussion in Europe, at least, regarding the issues like chlorine chicken and hormone beef, ractopamine pork. But these are, we have to see these are food safety issues. What we're talking about is what happens before the animal ends up as meat, and these are serious animal welfare issues. So far, the Commission is claiming that they do want to push TTIP through because it will influence what is happening in the U.S. and it will advance animal welfare in both the U.S. and Europe. But let's see what we saw from the proposed SPS chapter, which the EU actually presented a month ago in January 2015. The EU presented the chapter from the negotiations, their proposal regarding the sanitary and phytosanitary chapter, or else it's called SPS. And in that chapter, they have an article on animal welfare. And from analyzing this article, we saw that they do refer to animals as sentient beings, so they do recognize, they do include the recognition of sentience in animals, which is a positive, which is something positive. However, they also talk about exchange of information and know-how. They talk about strengthening collaboration, having cooperation between the two regions, promoting good practices, and also setting up a working group, and this is a possible appointment of a working group. However, they also refer to an alignment of regulatory standards between the two regions, which in our case, of course, we wonder how this will happen because these two regions have very, very different animal welfare standards. So how do you align these animal welfare standards when they're so far apart? Also, overall, the language is, yes, we do have the recognition of sentience, and again, but the language is very weak, and the text is non-binding. And the provisions included in the text, like cooperation and collaboration, are basically unenforceable. We wait to see the annexes, to see when they produce the annexes, to see what will actually the annexes say, because we believe they will have more information. But so far we do have an example of what might happen with TTIP. We have the example of cloning. Over a year ago, the Commission proposed, actually presented two proposals on cloning, banning the use of clones in farming, only for certain species, excluding poultry and fish. And they also banned the sale of products from clones. However, since they did not say anything regarding the import of descendants of clones, or they didn't say anything about labeling of products from descendants of clones, the proposal in effect, in a way, the outcome will be that we might end up having products from descendants of clones, and actually descendants themselves in Europe, in European farming, because there is no ban for this. And a lot of the discussion had centered around the fear that they did not want to upset the Americans. They did not want to upset a potential trading partner by having such a wide ban regarding descendants of clones. Some of the threats of what we see from this trade, from the negotiations, have to do with a number of issues. For example, the use of antibiotics as growth promoters is not permitted in the EU. The use of hormones in meat, the use of ractopamine that Joyce talked about, we consider it as it is actually a growth-promoting hormone which is used in the feed in pigs, and it has very serious side effects, so it has been banned. As I mentioned earlier, we have concerns about cloning and genetically modified animals, and we don't want to see these in Europe. We have certain labeling rules, for example, with the eggs that don't exist in the US. And these are the labeling from 0 to 3. The labeling system is actually obligatory. There are serious concerns from farmers now, saying that they have gone into a lot of expenses to upgrade their systems and to follow farm animal welfare legislation, and they feel that once they have products from the US coming in, that they will end up, they will hurt the farmers will actually be in a position where they won't be able to sell their products, or their products will cost higher, therefore the consumers will not buy them. We have a fear regarding existing legislation, especially when they talk about alignment. What is going to happen with existing legislation, and also a freeze in future legislation because of provisions like the investor-state dispute mechanism, which is included in TTIP so far, and where companies will be able to sue countries if their profits will be challenged or hurt. So therefore, This is, which means that member states and the EU might actually not want to proceed with more progressive legislation in animal welfare because of this fear of a future lawsuit. And we also have the potential effect, of course, has to do with the intensification of animal farming in the EU, which is something that we have not been able to avoid so far, but certainly there are still quite a good number of small and medium-sized farms. We have a lot more farms than in the US, and the average size of the farm is much smaller, so we have more family farming, and we feel that this process of intensification will certainly be the way forward if TTIP goes through, and will certainly be at the expense of more sustainable agricultural practices, but also certainly farm animal welfare in general. So this is the conclusion here, that we are afraid about the direction of food and farming in the EU and the kind of agriculture we want to have. And of course, the last point that I have to make has to do with the fact that we don't try to compare the EU and the US here, and we're not one against the other. It's what we're saying is that TTIP is that we want to move ahead and think about the interests of citizens and not the interests of corporations. So this is the message that we want to send to people.
Okay, thanks a lot, Olga, for your presentation. And I think we'll jump right into the questions that have been posed, and I would encourage participants, if you haven't asked questions yet, to please write your questions in the dialog box so that we can ask our panelists. So, and the first question is to Olga, and it's of kind of a general nature, and it's from Shefali Sharma from the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. And the question is just kind of a general, what's the difference between a regulation and a directive?
Okay, they have to do with the way these are implemented in member states. So usually, if I can put it in a simple way, regulation carries more weight than a directive.
Okay, so I think that helps in terms of, and then
yeah, if I can say it in just a few words.
Yeah, and I think that's good. So that means that the one is more enforceable than the other.
Directives, we have them for species. We have species-specific directives.
Okay, thank you. And the next question is from Karen Hansen-Kuhn at the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. And I think the question is mainly for Joyce, but I would encourage you both to answer if you have input on this. And her question is as follows. It sounds like most progress in the U.S. has happened at the state level, hopefully building up to change at the federal level later. Is there any federal legislation being considered that would bring U.S. standards up to EU levels?
Yeah, it's a two-part question in a sense, and that is, number one, is there any legislation, and number two, will the U.S. reach EU standards? I think we're so far behind EU standards, and if you were to look country by country, in the European Union or in Europe, Europe is very far ahead of us in banning practices that are still quite common in the U.S. I showed a slide which showed you the few states where practices have been banned, but throughout the rest of the country, those practices are still in full force. So we have a long way to go before we get anywhere close to what the EU is doing, and I say that with great sadness. I always think of my country as being first and foremost for everything, and when it comes to farmed animals, we are anything but. The legislation currently in Congress, there is nothing that would close the gap. There have been several efforts to try to ban or severely limit the use of antibiotics in animal feed, and that's an important public health issue. Goes beyond what's done to the animals. Animals in factory farms are fed subtherapeutic doses of antibiotics, and approximately 80% of the antibiotics sold in the United States is not sold for human use. It's sold to be fed to farmed animals, and that actually it is causing a big problem because it's giving rise to superbugs, and the antibiotics that have been used in the last generation when we were children are no longer being effective for things like strep throat and childhood ear infections and pneumonia. And so the American Medical Association and a lot of doctors are becoming quite alarmed at how these wonderful drugs that we've relied on are losing their value. So there is legislation. It hasn't really gone very far, but there have been proposals in Congress to limit the use or end the use of antibiotics. So, but in terms of federal proposals that would improve animal welfare, no, there's really nothing that is going to make a substantial improvement at the federal level. And you asked about it happening at the state level. Yes, to some extent, but really it's happening because the consumers are demanding change. That's what the producers are responding to in the U.S.
Okay, so it's more of a consumer-driven process than a government-driven process.
It really is. It's fascinating to see what's happening with the producers in the U.S. because of consumer demand.
Thanks. And Olga, just do you see any chances that this can actually be a way to raise standards, or is it merely something that will lower standards for animal welfare?
Well, this is what the European Commission has been suggesting in order to quiet down that will be able to influence the U.S. and have their standards changed in a way for the better. We, as far as we have seen, from studying the two different systems that we have, this is not possible, especially when they talk about an alignment of standards. It's not gonna, standards will not be aligned upwards. I mean, we wish that they would be, but certainly they won't. There's great pressure from agribusiness, the agribusiness industry, to both in the EU and the US, which means that if the agribusiness industry gets their way, it's gonna be down all the way. We also have the only good thing that we've seen in the proposed chapter was the recognition of sentience. But again, as we have seen in Europe, because this is part of the Treaty for the Functioning of the European Union, it's mentioned there. It does not carry any weight, really, because they exclude almost all animals and all practices currently in place, saying that yes, animals are sentient beings, but We have exclusions in terms of, if you have religious practices, if you have certain cultural practices, farming practices, etc. So basically, it's a nice word for the time being, but it does not have much weight, unfortunately. So having said that, and given the fact, as Joyce can tell you actually much better than I can, about the federal system and the federal legislation and state legislation and all the differences that exist, I see it almost impossible for the EU being able to influence in a positive way American legislation, American farm animal welfare legislation at the time being.
Can I add something to what Olga said? What we're learning is that what's good for the farmed animals actually is good for public safety, human health, and the environment. It really, what goes around comes around, and it's becoming very clear to a lot of scientists and others in the U.S. There's some wonderful reports that people can read if they want. The Pew Commission report on industrial animal farming is online. The Union of Concerned Scientists wrote a report called CAFO Uncovered. And ractopamine is a good example of what's good for humans is good for the animals, is good for the environment. Ractopamine is a drug that is supposedly used to create leaner meat, but the side effects on the animals are significant. Tremors, chronically elevated heart rates, broken limbs, and death in some cases. And residues of ractopamine go into the meat, which human beings then eat. And that's why it's been banned in 160 countries, and the EU has banned it, and yet in the US, it is not banned. It's in wide use. We're currently suing the Food and Drug Administration for approving this drug. It's been approved since 1999 and taking the risks that they're taking with human health and with the animals' well-being.
Thanks, Joyce. Yeah, and my own view is that kind of systems that approach is what we need to look at. And I have a question. I think it's not addressed to any one of you specifically, and you might be able to both give some input on this. And it's a question relating to cloning, and it's from Sonia Starosta. And the question is, how far is cloning relevant for animal welfare? Isn't it a food safety issue as well?
Sure, if I can say a few words about cloning. We know for sure that it is a serious farm animal welfare issue because there are many problems associated with the process of getting clones, both for the surrogate mothers but also for the embryos and newborns in terms of high miscarriage rates and the animals die can die very soon after they're born, and later on they have problems. So we know that for clones themselves, it is something. Actually, most clones, most animals cloned do not survive. Actually, past the first few days after birth. I mean, it's only the proportion of animals used in the process, to make clones is very high to the ones who actually survive. We have serious problems also relating to the kind of animals who are used to make clones. It's the animals who are producing more, whether that be meat or milk or anything else. Basically, they're taking animals who produce a lot more, but these are the animals usually who have a lot more problems because of all this weight, because of dairy cows, for example, who can have a lot of milk. This is accompanied by a lot of health problems. So we certainly don't want to have this kind of agriculture perpetuated through through cloning. There are also possible food safety issues, which I'm not the I'm not actually studying the food safety effects, but people are concerned about eating products from animal clones. As we certainly don't know how things will be like in many years. We have not, cloning has not been taking place for a long time, so we'll see about food safety, but certainly there are serious farm animal welfare issues.
Okay, thanks. So it really does have an impact on animal welfare. I think I'm going to jump to the next question, and this is actually around labeling, and I'm not quite sure who can answer this, but I'm going to try. The question is from Rosanna Aragon Plaza, and the question is as follows. Do you think that as a result of the TTIP, it would be possible for the U.S. to begin offering information on egg production methods in egg labels?
I am not as familiar with TTIP and labeling as I ought to be, so I apologize to begin with. However, we do focus a lot on labeling, and particularly when it comes to battery cages and egg-laying chickens. At the federal level, it is very difficult, we're finding, through the regulatory process, to get clear labeling. Recently, we were discussing, I was discussing with my class, the fact that the word natural is the most often used word in labeling, and if you look at the regulations at the federal level, the word natural means next to nothing. So when it comes to labeling eggs, there are several possibilities for the conditions that chickens could be raised in. One is the battery cages that I believe we showed you pictures of. Another is furnished cages, which sounds like they get little couches and chairs, and it doesn't mean that at all, but they do get a little bit more room and a little bit more privacy. And then there is cage-free, which means that the chickens are still indoors. They may be very crowded, but they're no longer in the battery cages. And then there's what's called free range. And what free range is intended to mean, at least to some of us, is that the chickens have access to outdoors, that they can feel the sun, that they can feel the grass or the dirt, that they can look for bugs. That's the most natural lifestyle that we would like for chickens to have. What we're finding is that because regulation is so lax, a lot of producers use the label that they think will earn them the highest profit. And a couple of years ago, we had a Sonoma County egg producer who was implying on his cartons that the chickens were free range when in fact they were indoors at all times and did not have access to the outdoors. So we sued him under consumer protection laws in California, false and misleading, and we brought a class action against this producer and settled the case, and it was very expensive for the producer. He had to remove the label and to clarify that the chickens at his farm were not free range, that they were in fact cage free. I would love to see at the federal level labeling that is very clear so that the consumer is not misled.
Okay, thanks. We're about 5 minutes from our intended stop point for this webinar, so I'm going to ask 2 questions at the end, and so one is from Rudiger Stegemann, and it's related to what about genetic engineering of farm animals and how would that relate to TTIP? And I'm going to say we have a whole other webinar that relates to GMOs, but not necessarily farm animals. So if you could just reflect on this And then I want to ask a kind of final question, and this is from Karen at IATP. And this is, it sounds like it would be hard to make changes in the right direction within TTIP. Are there other ways the US and EU activists or regulators are collaborating that might make more sense? So, because I think that can give us a little bit of future orientation on what we want to work with on this. So,
you know, I want to clarify that through selective breeding, we already have created animals who are rather monstrous and who are producing at levels that you would not believe. Cows are producing twice as much milk as they did 40 years ago. Chickens a century ago produced 100 eggs a year. Now they produce 250 eggs per year. So even without genetic alteration and cloning and any of that, these animals have been pushed well beyond their physical limits. So be aware of that, this is already going on. And what's the right direction forward? It's interesting that just this past week, an advisory committee to the U.S. Department of Agriculture on dietary guidelines came out with a 571-page report in which they advised USDA that for reasons of American health, we need to stop eating as much meat as we're eating. We need to go to more fruits and vegetables to combat a lot of the diseases Americans now have, such as the cancers and heart disease and the obesity that is rampant in our country. It was a fascinating report, and as you can imagine, the meat industry is very unhappy with it. But this is the U.S. Department of Agriculture's own scientific advisory committee, and I think personally, that is the way that we need to go. A lot of arrows are pointing in that direction from a lot of different venues, from the American Medical Association to scientists, that we need to return to having meat as a side dish and vegetables and fruit as our mainstay to create a more healthy populace.
Okay, great. And then if you could just kind of both quickly, because we're running out of time, reflect on this idea. Are there other ways the US and EU activists or regulators are collaborating that might make more sense around these issues?
Okay, I'll just say a couple of things here and then Joyce can take it from there. Regarding GM animals, I just wanted to add to what Joyce said that yes, selective breeding has done something that we never thought that would be done so far, and in many ways it has been detrimental for animals. In terms of the new breeds we see and the focus on production and continuous production of animals, which actually results in really bad health for them and, of course, animal welfare. But we feel that GM animals is also a threat that's coming. We hear about about GM salmon coming to Europe, so this is something that we have to seriously think about and see how we're going to deal with it in Europe too. Regarding the report that came out from the U.S. was actually, we welcome this advice, and we feel that if we are going to make a difference for farm animals, we have to change the way we treat them, and we have to change our consumption patterns. We cannot overall throughout the world, there are about 70 billion land animals slaughtered every year. This is incredible. And this number goes up because of other countries in the developing world starting to eat a lot more meat and animal products. We have to change this. Especially in the Western world, we overconsume animal products. And we need to look at other ways. We need to look at also the benefits for our health and the environment, besides for animal welfare, of other plant-based diets too. So we have to take this into consideration. And finally, regarding Karen's comment on the way forward, we would welcome, we would very much like to see a movement from both sides of the Atlantic to actually join the anti-TTIP and anti-intensive agriculture model that we all are against. We need to mobilize, and we need to form partnerships with other groups and NGOs in order to be able to have a say in this as citizens of both regions.
Okay, thank you. I think we're getting to the point where I'm going to have to, we're 2 minutes over, so I'm going to give some conclusions. And let me first apologize that we haven't been able to answer everybody's questions. And what we'll try to do is we have your questions on record, and we'll try to get back to you with answers on those. And I think that was a very good summary, Olga, for some of the things we need to do. We need to build more coalitions, and I think it's this kind of systems approach, working for I would say a food system that we want on both sides of the Atlantic. And so it's not just about animal welfare, but there are a lot of interlinkages between animal welfare, antimicrobial resistance, and food safety issues. And I would like to thank the panelists and the participants for helping us to explore this issue on TTIP and animal welfare. And I would like to encourage you, as Olga said, there's a lot of room for continuing our collaboration. And on your screen, you'll see our email addresses. ARC is doing a lot of work on TTIP and how it affects food and farming, and I'm sure both Olga and Joyce and I would welcome your comments, and if you want to get more involved in working on TTIP and what it's, I guess, why it's bad for good food and farming. So thank you very much for your participation, and with that I will close the webinar.